Welcome everyone, this is the history of the Republican Party. The Republican Party is one of the two main political factions in the United States currently, the other being the Democratic Party. Also known as the GOP, or Grand Old Party, it's had a long and uniquely storied history that spans for now almost 2 centuries in existence. The party's creation and origins starts sometime in the early 1850s, universally agreed that it was formed by 1854 by various different ideological and political backgrounds, namely from Whigs, Free Soilers, a political group that opposed the expansion of slavery out west, and mainly disenfranchised Democrats. They were created mainly around the time of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which, long story short, gave the state and people within the state's popular sovereignty to vote whether their state would be admitted as a slave or non-slave state. The Republican Party and this new conglomeration were created as the party of anti-slavery, primarily for stopping the overall expansion of slavery in the Western territories and for its eventual end. Getting its footing over the course of the 1850s, the party grew large enough that they eventually became one of the 2 largest parties in the country, to oppose specifically the Democrats with the nomination of John C. Fremont, the first Republican presidential nominee. Eventually, in the following election, they would nominate Abraham Lincoln, who would win and be the President of the United States during the Civil War, where the North and subsequently the Republicans would win the conflict. Now, the party in my view can be divided into about 7 different eras, with varying degrees of popularity, policy changes, and leaders that all define that particular time and period. The first era, in my view, is the Civil War era, or Reconstruction era, ranging from Lincoln to the end of Ulysses S. Grant's terms as president. This era was defined by the aggressive push for the complete abolition of slavery, and at many times, extreme and radical changes and pushes for policies that would define that particular era. Republicans would push for aggressive and at times authoritative laws, rules, and regulations, notably and specifically many of the Reconstruction-era laws that would hurt them in the long term, as many people viewed them as overreaching, stepping on constitutional rights, and in the process losing many northern states in the contested election of 1876. Radical enough that they also attempted to impeach Andrew Johnson, the president after Abraham Lincoln, for not going harder on many of the Reconstruction plans that Grant, his successor, would try to fulfill, only to eventually go down the path of bloated governments and political corruption that would sink them again in the election of 1876. The next era, in my opinion, is the Gilded Age era, ranging from his fraudulency, Rutherford B. Hayes, till Benjamin Harrison's term as president. Republicans of the time largely benefited from manufacturing and industrialization, continuing to ride the coattails of the Civil War era for roughly the next 30 years, many Republican presidents of that time being Civil War veterans themselves. Though despite this, many Republicans changed. They had different levels of ideological leans, meaning that they were Republican primarily because of where they were born, but whether they were progressive or conservative was really up to them. There wasn't a definitive lean for the party at this point. The one thing that did unite them was that they were Northerners and generally a part of the economic model of industrialization and trade. The biggest issues that impacted the time was the standardization of currency, Republicans usually following and agreeing on a gold standard. Republicans of this time benefited from strong economies for the most part, despite political infighting and what constitutes establishment politics by today's view. They were very clear and ever-present as they had a foothold in the American political system, which also, unfortunately, led to a lot of corruption. Footnote here. There is corruption all across these eras and also with varying political parties, well, pretty much all political parties as well. This era, for example, being that despite having many popular and political leaders, most of these presidents were individuals who most of us don't even truly know, because many of them were truly not very well-known commodities. An example being Chester A. Arthur, the 21st president, technically never holding real public office before becoming the vice president. This era, in my view, spans a long time during the Gilded Age of America, and in many ways is the reason the Gilded Age exists. The next era is what I call the Teddy Roosevelt era, or the Progressive era in some ways, ranging from McKinley's term as president till the end of Calvin Coolidge's term as president. Pushing forth in many ways a nationalistic identity, progressive ideals on economics, and a clear and expensive push towards foreign intervention, the party leaned heavily on Teddy and the ideas of Teddy for a period that would last roughly 20 plus years or so, which would also unfortunately lead to the rise of Woodrow Wilson as president. This era's issues were based on the expansion of the federal government and the attempts to weed and push out varying degrees of corruption, usually and most prominently defined by the relatively bookend presidents of Teddy Roosevelt and Calvin Coolidge. These years are defined for the Republican Party by their economic freedom and technological push for ingenuity and progress. The next era is the FDR era, ranging from Herbert Hoover all the way until the next Republican win, which would take about 20 years. In this era, the party is largely lost and in a shell of its former self, being blamed for the economic turmoil known as the Great Depression, and defined by its chaos, unable to field strong leaders or candidates. This period of roughly 20 years is defined by soul-searching and a push towards what would be seen as a more conservative push against the radical and progressive nature that was becoming the Democratic Party. Many prominent Republicans also didn't have a good look to them, as they were seen as the rich industrialists, which at the time of rising unions were seen as enemies to the working class of people in the United States. Alf London, the 1936 nominee, making his money in oil and being a millionaire, as a good example. Republicans, despite FDR's overwhelming popularity and poise, had some legs during this time, and despite shrinking as a whole during this period, stayed strong and didn't collapse as a party, and eventually gained as the years went on. The next era is what I call the Nixon era, defined largely by the period that Nixon was a part of politics, reigning from the Eisenhower presidency till the end of the Ford presidency. This era is defined by infighting and an identity crisis due to the party unable to find a clear and discernible direction to go, as many candidates and prominent politicians of that time were ranging from a large variety of different political viewpoints, examples being a progressive leader like Nelson Rockefeller, a moderate like Spiro Agnew, or Mr. Conservative himself, Barry Goldwater. This includes varying different policies that weren't very unifying and oftentimes were unpopular, like for Barry Goldwater, running for the presidency in 1964. Republicans at this time were also not aided by the overreaching aspects of the federal government at the time and the turmoil that would become the 60s and 70s in the United States. Nixon is the most apparent and well-known Republican of this time and era due to him being considered a moderate and having a solid popular base despite his conflicts with the deep state. Ultimately, what perfectly encapsulates this era is the ascension of Ford as president, who by today's terms would probably be considered a very relatively progressively moderate Republican, and was someone without a particular plan or voice that the people could have confidence in. The next era is the Reagan era, which predominantly goes from his presidency in 1980 to, I would say, 2012, the time of Barack Obama's second term as president. This era is defined by a unified message of conservatism, specifically economically and socially, a push for lower taxes, a strong military, and is also defined by its strong nationalistic push and message. During this period of time, it is filled with strong leaders and immensely corrupt leaders who sold out the American citizenry, notably George H.W. Bush being the singular individual who pushed out NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, taking many jobs away from the American people. This era is also unfortunately defined by war on terror and the push for many unconstitutional laws that have created more of a surveillance state in this country than there has ever been before. This was a push for a nationalistic identity with a message that, especially in the later years of the Reagan era, comes across as hypocritical in the eyes of many people, as American citizens felt sold out due to the Iraq War and subsequent conflicts in the Middle East. Many Republicans, faster than ever during this era, sold out to what is the military-industrial complex that in many ways was encapsulated by the George W. Bush administration and his time and era in office, portrayed in media in that light. The last and current era is the era of Trump, spanning from what I would say 2012 to today. This era of politics is very complicated and very unique, but largely summed up, it is a large portion of the American population all over the political spectrum uniting over time as specifically a populist-based or populist party, basically meaning the people versus the elites, forming under various groups of disenfranchised citizens, whether it be from people from Occupy Wall Street, the millions of Democrats betrayed by Obama politics, or disgruntled conservatives who saw establishment Republicans as do-nothings. This starts in many ways with individuals like Ron Paul and continuing on with Donald Trump. This particular group or wing of the Republican Party, named MAGA, has taken a strong hold of the party despite increased and increasingly apparent mischaracterizations of the current party, labeling them as racist, fascists, in just about every single opportunity they can. Largely viewed and valued a smaller federal government, specifically reduction in illegal immigration and a free economy, the party has largely gained in recent years and continues to grow just by daily negative media attacks, and reasons being a very strong and clear message and the cratering of the Democratic Party. This era is ongoing, and we will watch with unbated breath. We will see how this will go.